Hello and welcome. You're watching No Spin. I'm Nidhi Razdan. With the threat of China weighing on their minds, the leaders of India, the United States, Japan and Australia, the Quad, met in Tokyo today and announced more steps to solidify their alliance. That had included a new maritime collaboration to counter illegal fishing by Chinese vessels, cooperation on climate change, cybersecurity and infrastructure. The joint statement calling the Quad a force for good and reiterating their principles of democratic values, rule of law, sovereignty and territorial integrity. Without naming Taiwan and China, the statement goes on to say, we discussed our respective responses to the conflict in Ukraine and assessed its implications for the Indo-Pacific. Quad leaders also reiterated their strong message to maintain peace and stability in the region. Shortly afterwards, the Prime Minister and President Biden held a bilateral meeting, and any differences that existed over Russia earlier seem to be a thing of the past, at least publicly today, with President Biden full of praise for India's track record as a democracy and for what he wants to do with India-US relations. He wants us to be the closest friends on earth. That's literally what he said. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But meanwhile, as Quad leaders met in Tokyo today, Chinese and Russian fighter jets decided to carry out joint flying exercises nearby. Japan's defense minister saying that they had expressed grave concerns to both countries over these flights, which took place while the Quad leaders were meeting and talking about regional security. The planes did not breach territorial airspace, and it is the fourth time since November that these flights have been conducted by China and Russia. Well, joining us first on the program tonight, Barry O'Farrell, Australia's envoy to India, for more on what the Quad is going to do next. Thank you very much, High Commissioner, for joining us. How should we look at the Quad and the cooperation we're seeing within the grouping now? Has it been more solidified, particularly with the new economic framework agreement that was announced on Monday?
I think the Quad goes from strength to strength. From day one, it's been very practical in addressing, firstly, the issues of COVID, but then moving increasingly out to some of the challenges that the region faces, from climate change through to sovereignty. And
is there potential for then the Quad to do much more together? What areas could those potentially be?
Well, I think it's interesting to note that the Quad's only had 4 leaders meeting, only 2 of those in person, and it's come a long way in a very short amount of time. And each time we're seeing more and more practical initiatives being unveiled. And today, of course, we have the climate change initiative that's been unveiled as well. So I think the list is limitless. Today, the statement refers to space, it refers to cybersecurity, it refers to deepening responsibility and activity in those areas, because, of course, there's no finish line in any of these areas. And the Quad leaders are clearly very concerned about ensuring that what they deliver, what can be shared with other like-minded countries in the region, deliver that free, open and secure Indo-Pacific region that they want.
Well, the elephant in the room is clearly China, which has already said that the Quad is doomed to fail, amongst other things. How do you see the Chinese reaction to the Quad?
Well, unfortunately, it's predictable, and it's disturbing that any country would criticise a group of countries who are simply trying to promote a rules-based order, sovereignty and a free, open region focused on promoting the rule of law and the right to live in peace. So the Quad will continue to do what the Quad's been doing, practically through ASEAN and other countries across the Indo-Pacific region, trying to improve lives, to improve security and to improve the economic circumstances and the health circumstances of citizens, and China will continue to comment.
Right, there's also just been a change of government in Australia literally days ago. Will there be a continuity in foreign policy on the Quad in particular? There seem to be some suggestions that perhaps the approach to China may see a subtle shift.
Well, there's no doubt that the attendance of the Australian Prime Minister at the Quad demonstrates just how committed the new government is. The Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, had been sworn in 3 hours before he caught a plane to Tokyo. The next morning he's at his first Quad meeting with Prime Minister Modi, President Biden and of course Prime Minister Kishida. And he said in that statement that government in Australia may have changed, but the commitment to the Quad has not changed in Australia. And I think the fact that the first bilateral meeting between the Australian Foreign Minister was with External Affairs Minister Jaishankar again underscores the importance of the India-Australia relationship and the fact that, as I suggested on election eve, when it was clear the government had changed, that the relationship will continue to grow under the new government. And as I've said, Anthony Albanese is no stranger to India. He's travelled here privately, he's travelled here as a Member of Parliament, and he's clearly committed.
Well, finally, High Commissioner, there was some heartburn clearly initially in the Quad over India's stand on Russia, maybe not by Australia publicly, but do you think there's a greater understanding within the grouping now of India's position?
I think there has been a greater understanding, and that was evidenced by Boris Johnson's visit to India recently, where he said that the world understands India's history with Russia. But equally in today's Quad leaders statement, it talks about the discussion on the respective countries' positions, not just in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, but also the humanitarian crisis that all countries are trying to contribute to.
All right, Barry O'Farrell, Australia's High Commissioner to India, thank you very much for joining us on NDTV this evening. Well, let's go straight to our panelist this evening. Ambassador K.C. Singh is with us, former diplomat and strategic affairs expert. Tanvi Madan, senior fellow with the Brookings Institution, is joining us. Suhasini Heather, the national editor and diplomatic affairs editor of The Hindu, and Derek Grossman, senior defense analyst with the RAND Corporation. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Ambassador K.C. Singh, lots to talk about. The Quad is one part of it, and then, that meeting between President Biden and Mr. Modi separately. But on the Quad itself, do you think it's finally, taking a more concrete shape in terms of areas of cooperation and the fact that they have now met much more frequently in this past year?
Look, there were a couple of concerns. One was that has US got distracted by Europe and the war in Ukraine? And I think that's why President Biden made it a point to visit South Korea as well as Japan and to recommit themselves to the Indo-Pacific and also hold the meeting of the Quad there. So I was saying there is the optics of it, which was very important. And then specifically on 2 or 3 occasions when he was asked about Taiwan, even though his office tried walking his comments back, but he is very clear. He says if the Chinese take military action, US will intervene. This was as specific as any president had been. So which means he was balancing finally US position vis-a-vis China and indicating that they have not got distracted by Russia. That will go on in Europe. They'll give all the military assistance. But these are treaty obligations defending Taiwan. And therefore it was a warning given to China that they should not try what the Russians have tried in Ukraine. In fact, the Chinese are watching very carefully to see that if the European countries and NATO come together and you have the other treaty allies, which is Japan, South Korea, Australia joining them, then they don't want to be cut out of global trade. So it's a warning signal. And it is important that this year, Bloomberg has said that the Chinese economy for the first time since 1976 will grow at a slower pace than that of the US. 2% as against the US growing as 2.6%. So it's a very ascendant President Biden who's managed to handle the COVID crisis, which Trump handed to him rather well. And he's therefore come to Asia on a high note. And therefore that is why Quad has got new life put into it. They've given it an economic dimension, though it is more optical again, because there are no tariffs being reduced. US is not giving access to anyone
to
the US market.
I wanted to ask
it's more about standards and...
Right. I wanted to ask Tanvi Madan about that. But Tanvi's done a lot of work on the Quad and passionately follows it with emojis as well on social media, which I've seen no one else do quite so well. But Tanvi Madan, on a serious note, what did you think? Was this more optics, less substance? And I have to ask that, how uncomfortable would Beijing actually be with these meetings? This is not a military alliance. This is not a security alliance. So if push comes to shove, what can the Quad do if China, let's say, invades our territory or does something to someone else in this alliance?
So I think a couple of things. So on your first question on what was achieved, I think Ambassador Singh mentioned a couple of points. I'd say another kind of part of the optics that was important was the Australian Prime Minister making it a point so speedily. He might not have wanted it so speedily, but nonetheless made an effort, and not just for the Quad meeting, but some bilaterals. I think that helps to set the tone early and before he has had engagements with China. So to be able to kind of get that socialization of and meetings with other key leaders, partnerships, partner leaders. I think the other thing is, and you saw this up front in the Quad statement, which is that the first year since the first leaders meeting was about developing an agenda and mechanisms, and this second year has to be about delivery. And so I think the idea wasn't to expand the agenda, but to focus on, and you saw some pretty concrete initiatives coming up, including a new maritime domain awareness partnership, a debt management portal, a satellite data portal, basically saying to the region, this is about providing you help and solutions as you asked for, and capacity building so that you can be resilient. We're improving your resilience. On the question of what the Quad does, as you said, it's not an alliance. It has chosen not to be an alliance. So I think each country is going to react differently. India, for example, will not join hostilities if there's US-China hostilities over Taiwan, for instance. The US is not going to send boots on the ground, according to India's preference, if there's a China-India clash. Having said that, just two very quick ways. I think that the Quad, it shouldn't be lost on anybody that the three countries that were most supportive of India during the 2020 ongoing crisis, rhetorically particularly, but also in other forms of assistance, were the other Quad member states. The other thing is, in any, whether it's vis-a-vis India or any other kind of conflicts, these are not going to be just kinetic or military at the border. It's going to be maritime, it's going to be cyber, and you do have some pretty concrete proposals in terms of developing resilience and response that the Quad is actually engaging in.
Right. So Hasni, Haider, you know, how do you think Beijing would be looking at this, apart from the rhetoric we hear from official media and the spokespersons? You think that they're genuinely worried by this coming together of the Quad?
Yes, and I think Beijing has made a point every time the Quad meets or announces a new initiative of somehow either belittling it or saying this is a worrying kind of a development, or calling it an Asian NATO. We saw, I think, a Chinese state newspaper putting experts calling even the IPEF an economic NATO. There's no question that Beijing takes the Quad seriously as a containment of China kind of grouping, whether or not it is that. What I also find very interesting is actually Beijing does not react to AUKUS in quite the same way, the Australia, UK, US.
Yes.
And I would suggest that that is because the Quad is made up of one member, which is India, which is not a treaty alliance partner in any way. There's no military treaty between India and the others, and particularly with the United States, that binds them. I think it's also significant that while Prime Minister Modi has made these very strong statements there at the Quad on the Indo-Pacific, at the end of the day, India is still a part of BRICS, is still a part of SCO. Next month, there will be a BRICS a virtual summit. Next year, India will host an SCO summit. So, you know, the fact is that India does continue to walk this tightrope, and it hasn't walked away from either side just yet. So I think it's significant what we see the Quad doing each time. There's at least an incremental increase in the kind of areas where they are seeing partnerships. Right. But essentially, at the moment, that partnership is not a strategic one. Even the military exercises that the four countries do together, Operation Malabar, is not under the Quad's purview. It's the Quad countries doing a military exercise.
I think it's important that you also pointed out, you know, the fact that India does still have these stakes in BRICS, for example, or SCO, and China is very much a part of that. Russia is a part of that as well. Derek Grossman, though, it's interesting also because the Quad has been seen as a grouping of democracies coming together. There have been a lot of question marks about India's democratic credentials from various agencies around the world. Yet today we saw President Biden fully praise India for its commitment to democracy. He said that with the Prime Minister of India sitting across from him, and, you know, said that you're doing this wonderful commitment to democracy, and ultimately it's about democracies and autocracies. So has the US kind of come to terms with, you know, the democracy that India is, for want of a better expression?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the Biden administration came in pretty red hot on putting forward a values-based foreign policy. And over time, I think reality has kind of set in that you can certainly prioritize working with like-minded democratic countries, but there's also going to be, against authoritarian countries, but there's also going to be a lot of in between. And if you really are in this quote unquote extreme competition against China and you're trying to weaken Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, you're going to have to work with other countries that don't necessarily share all of your values. And in the case of India, I think it was very interesting when Secretary Tony Blinken went there last year and made it very clear to his counterparts that when the U.S. talks about democracy, it really is a two-way conversation. It's not, American lectures of India and of other countries. We are also an imperfect union, and we're striving to become a better one. And we are also going to learn from India and other countries going forward. And that kind of subtle shift in that values-based foreign policy, I think, has really made all the difference. Now, that said, during the 2+2 meetings in D.C. in April, Blinken, during the press conference with Jai Shankar, right out the gate, talked about human rights and democracy. And so that kind of, that is still there. I don't think that's gonna go anywhere, right? But I think in the case of, Modi and his government, I mean, yes, the U.S. certainly has concerns, but we are willing to see past that clearly under the Biden administration for the greater good.
Clearly, we saw a lot of sort of bonhomie, as we said, between President Biden and Mr. Modi today. I just want to pull out this bite of the Prime Minister when he went to the U.S. And endorsed Trump for president. And we know that really upset the Biden administration, the Biden sort of group on the other side. Let's listen in just to remind everybody what he had said then.
अब की बार ट्रम्प सरकार.
And if you remember, Ambassador K.C. Singh, what a furor that caused, because it was the first time an Indian Prime Minister had sort of taken an open political position in a US election. You think that's all in the past now? You think Biden's let go of that?
Well, yes, obviously, because what is on the table is much more important. Climate change, an assertive Russia, a war in Europe, and a China which is kind of sitting on the fence. You want to make sure they don't start giving military help to Russia. At the same time, you want to contain them, but they've broken out of that containment and gone and done a security deal with Solomon Islands. So they're breaking out the island chain, and that is also what upset the Australians. So I think all these countries realize that, yes, there is, and after all, after 4 years of Trump and what he did, and considering a majority of the Republican voters even today think the last election was stolen, the Americans realize that it's really democracy everywhere is under threat or is work in progress. So there are no absolute standards that they are gold standard and every other country has fallen below that standard. So they become much more tolerant, I think, after the Trump experience. So that evangelism is not there because they realize there's one finger pointing back at them. By the same time,
but it was strange. Derek Grossman is right. You just had Antony Blinken standing on stage a couple of months ago saying the opposite, and now you have a very different vibe that's coming, from the U.S. government. Tanvi Madan, just a quick last comment from everyone. In terms of how the Quad is coming together, how do you think that complicates India's own relationship with China at the moment, which is obviously not good, but obviously there's also channels of communication that are still open. How do you think that these will play out simultaneously?
I think the thing that has done most to complicate India's relationship with China is China. And, for the longest time, there was an argument that if India held back from deepening ties with like-minded partners, including the US, or either revived or elevated the Quad or did more with it, that this would somehow, provoke China. But China seems to be provoked all the time anyway. So the question for India at the end of the day is, do you not then prepare for the eventuality that China seems to be taking these actions anyway? I know there are some who link that, China is doing this because of India's relationship with the US. Well, in that case, China perhaps needs to better analysts of India, because if anything, they have actually pushed India into US arms even more, and definitely into elevating the Quad and even adding a security dimension to it. I don't think it is a secret or coincidental that India's engagement with the Quad, both in terms of revival and elevation, followed the 2017 Doklam crisis and then the 2020 crisis that is still ongoing. So I think, at some point India has to be prepared for a China that you never know what it's going to do, because the things that India did to deter Beijing clearly didn't work, and that included holding back on deepening its partnerships.
All right, I'm completely out of time. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us with perspective on that big story today. A quick social media comments coming in on this story from Cool. We called it the Squad. Rohit Kapoor says that can the Squad afford to ignore the dragon? They have a lot of dependency on China for trade. Interesting point. Whereas Ashish Roy has written in that the dragon is cunning and will not be trapped by any Squad. That's it on the show tonight. Thanks for watching.